Introduce Rabbi Dr. Simcha Raphael, and his notes are here, and I'm not going to read his notes. As we said, don't read the notes. But Dr. Simcha is a person who has many, many talents and many gifts. And I first encountered his work when I was studying at the seminary, and he's written a really classic book on the issues of the Judaism and afterlife. It really is, I think, the foremost book in the area of understanding Judaism in the afterlife, which is a complicated topic, and I'm sure he'll be talking about that in some ways tangentially and then directly throughout the course of the weekend. I think there are a few important things that I want to highlight. First of all, his spiritual and intellectual work is clearly rigorous and significant and important, and I'm sure we'll hear that as well. I'm sure that you'll hear his Canadian accent, which brings me back to my youth, back to my childhood as well, as a proud Canadian that he is. And most importantly, he really is a mensch. He's a very kind and caring human being, and we're delighted to be able to welcome him to B'nai Ammona. So you can read his bio online, you can read it in the bulletin, you'll hear it several times during the course of the weekend, but I wanted to introduce him as a mensch. Our pleasure to have Rabbi Dr. Simcha Raphael with us this Shabbat. Please give him a warm welcome.
So I want to thank you for an introduction that would make my mother very proud. And Shabbat Shalom. It's fantastic to be here. It's actually a little daunting being up here because there's such a wonderful, it's not even Mikdash Ma'at, it's sort of a large temple, but I am so impressed with being able to be somewhere where there's such a robust Shabbos community. Somebody said, have you been to such a large community? I said, I've been to a lot, but this is the most robust Shabbos community I've been to in a while. So I want to thank your wonderful Rabbi Carney Rose for the invitation to be here. And I want to thank the family, the Gallant family, for setting up the Motivational and Inspirational Weekend series. It's wonderful to be able to be up here this weekend. So our theme... Did this just go down? I gotta go. Our theme this weekend are the mysteries of life, death, and the world beyond. And over the next few days, we will be exploring Jewish wisdom, dealing with what we call end-of-life issues. Apparently, it's more kosher to use the word end of life than dying and death. So we're just talking about end-of-life issues, okay? Now, in my own experiences, there were a number of sudden deaths in my family, in my friendship circle, both as a child and as a young man. At 21, my closest friend was killed in a car accident. I had been with him that evening on a Saturday night. He said he was going to visit his father, who was an Orthodox Jew. He would go visit his father every Motzei Shabbos, and in the middle of the night, that night, I got a call that he had been killed in a car accident. And that sent me on a kind of journey over many years in my learning, my teaching, and then my work as a psychologist, as a rabbi, as a Jewish death educator. I worked for a while as a resident psychologist at a Jewish funeral home. And through these experiences, I've searched in our tradition, I've searched in Torah for guidelines, for wisdom, to help us deal with the challenge of end-of-life issues. Basically, my operating question is, what does Torah teach us to have a sane Jewish approach to life and death? Now, I want to put it in a context. Ain't none of us getting out of here alive. Now relax, I'm not talking about tonight specifically. But the reality is that mortality is hardwired into the human condition. And my question becomes, what is it that our tradition teaches us? What kind of tools, what kind of attitudes to help us to be able to deal with these kinds of issues when they come close to our family? And I know for some of you it's current. So that's just, I understand doing this work. I'm not just teaching the mind. I'm really talking to people's hearts. So tonight I'm going to talk about the biblical story of the death of Jacob, found at the end of the book of Genesis. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about Moses' death in Torah and Midrash. Then Shavuot is a good time to look at the book of Ruth. And Ruth and Naomi were trauma survivors. They were bereaved women, and they had been through a lot of loss. So what do we learn from them? And Sunday is Yizkor. So with all of these topics, we're going to have a lively weekend of learning over the next couple of days. The reality is that today you could go listen to Dr. Ruth or a variety of other talk shows where people tell their deepest sexual secrets. And it's death rather than sex that is the new intimacy in our times. Because nobody wants to talk about that. Sex has become popularized in a certain kind of way. But death, we don't want to talk about it. My teacher, Reb Zalman, who I want to remember here today, used to say, the old Jewish mythos was you didn't want to evoke the angel of death, Malach HaMavet. So he said, one time I looked in the Brooklyn phone book, and there was somebody, it said Molech Hamowitz. That was the guy's name in the phone book. He said, I wasn't going to call them just in case. So here we are. Look, it's the 21st century, and there's more deaths in hospice. There's a death with dignity movement. There's life extension. There's green burial. There's people living past their 90s and into their hundreds. We're living in a time of profound transition. And so what I want to do tonight is press the rewind button on the Torah. This keeps going in and out. And on the Torah cycle, and look at the story of Jacob's death at the end of the book of Genesis. Now, does anyone need a text? Because I think you already got your party favors. Are there any more around? Does anybody else need to get a text? Are there any more available to distribute? Okay. See, it's the thirst for Torah that everybody wants to make sure they have Torah in there. There you go. Okay, so here's the story. Parshat Vayechi takes place at the end of the book of Genesis. Now, I don't know where you go in the winters, whether you go to Arizona or whether you go to Florida, but usually it appears around the end of the year, so you may have missed it, so I need to give you a review. Here's the story, okay? The text will be there. Hang on to the text, and we'll look at it in a second. It's this strange story about this old guy is about to die. Now, he had 2 wives. He had 2 concubines. His daughter was raped. Did they teach you that one in Hebrew school? His son was thrown into the pit. It's already beginning to sound like the National Enquirer or something like that, right? He spent 17. He gets down to Egypt towards the end of his life. He spends 17 years there with Joseph, with his children, with his grandchildren. Then he calls his children together to give them his last wishes and blessings. He blesses his children, and then the old man dies. And that's really the story that we're going to read. So sometimes I like to have people read it in the audience, but I think in this room I'm going to get to be the reader. So I'm looking at the top of your page, and I'm going to start with Genesis 47, 28 to 31. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." "I will do as you say," he said. "Swear to me," he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. What's going on in this scene? Let's ask the question, what is his attitude towards his own death? He's 147 years old, so we figure he had some life experience. And we see here somebody who is prepared to die without fear. He accepts his own death realistically, and he doesn't hide his feelings from his family. And in our society, that's culturally radical.
The doctor knows the patient's going to die. The patient knows the patient's going to die. The patient's family knows that the patient's going to die. And nobody wants to talk to each other. And you've heard stories like that, and I hear stories like that very often. And Jacob, he says, I am about to be gathered to my people. I'm about to die. He has this complete willingness to accept death realistically. And we want to create a culture where we have more of an openness to dying and death, because that's hardwired into Jewish tradition. There are many ways in which Judaism is very open about that. Look, we're going to say Yizkor in the middle of Shavuot. We say Yizkor in the middle of Sukkot. We say Yizkor, in the middle, the end of Sukkot, the end of Pesach. So often in our families, people are just uncomfortable about the topic and they don't want to face it. So Jacob becomes for us a model that we can emulate. And what's very interesting, his example rubs off on his son Joseph. The next pasuk, the next phrase, the next sentence here, Genesis 50:24, to go back to the text, then Joseph said to his brothers, almost the same language of his father, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's openness towards his own mortality generates more openness. We learn our attitudes towards death in our families, in our family of origin. We could spend the rest of the night here, and I know I can't do that because the rabbi has me on like a short timer. He's going to pull the plug on me at a certain point, right? But I could say, tell me about your earliest experiences on dying and death, and we can have a whole conversation for the rest of the evening. But you can think for a moment, who are your models? What were your early experiences, and who were your models? How did you learn about dying and death? Did it have that same kind of realism and openness that Jacob demonstrated? Or was it much more reserved and uncomfortable and hushed tones and silence? I had a client, her father died and the brother came in that afternoon, her father's brother came in that afternoon, took out the father's clothes, and they never talked about the father ever again. People have stories like that. So that, again, are the models that you learned effective ones that you want to pass on to the next generation? Or do you need to do something differently than the way in which you learned it? My mother was 10 years old when her father was killed in a car accident. And my grandmother was 33 years old, an Eastern European immigrant who had 3 children. My mother was 10, was the oldest of them. And she said to my mother, which was very interesting, wherever your father was that day, God would have taken him from us. Which it was kind of benevolent considering that her own brother drove the car in which her husband was killed. But we told that story over and over. I didn't know my mother when I was 10 years old. But as I grew up, my mother told us that story, and we lived in a home where there had been a lot of deaths and where we talked openly about it. So I learned to do this work by osmosis in my own family. And every time you have an opportunity to pass on a legacy of openness towards dying and death, you can do that with the people around you. Okay, so let's keep swimming in the text and continue the conversation. So I'm going to 48, 3-4. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and will increase your numbers. I will make you a community of people, and I will give this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you. And then the next one, as I was returning from Padan to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrat. So I buried her there beside the road to Ephrat, that is Bethlehem. So what's he doing here? What he's doing is he's preparing for his own demise. He's doing what we call conscious dying. He's doing a life review. He's looking at his life. He's looking at the good stuff. God appeared to me. He's looking at the bad stuff. We had to bury Rachel on the road to Bethlehem. He's evaluating his life and he's reflecting on it. And also what he does is he blesses his progeny. He offers blessings, not in this passage here, but he speaks his mind to his kids. Some kids he chews them out, some kids he gives them blessing. But what he does is he expresses love and appreciation. It sort of reminds me of that story. The kid comes in and says, Dad, I won a Nobel Prize. And the father says, yeah, but did you leave the wrench on the patio? You know, sometimes we're much better at giving criticism than giving love and affection. So we learn from him about right relationship in the face of mortality. This is what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross calls finishing business. So what we want to be able to do is leave behind when our time comes, when our Me'av Esrim, when our 120. We say in Judaism you should live to 120. My uncle Morris, when I'd say that to my aunt, she should live to 120, he'd say, how about if she lived to 119 so I could have one quiet year? Right? So what we want to be able to do is live that life where our relationships are cleaned up. So my thinking on this one is, who are the people that you need to go back to and say, I love you and I'm sorry and I screwed up? Because Judaism teaches that our capacity to do tshuva is what gives us the capacity to live a meaningful life and hence a meaningful death. Okay, what else does he do? I'm going down the page here. Then he gave these instructions, Genesis 49, 29 to 32. He gave these instructions. I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre and Canaan, which Abraham bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite, along with the field. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. There I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. Basically, he's saying, look, kids, go look in my safety deposit box. I have a deed for my burial plot. But what's he doing is he's making sure his affairs are in order. And looking around the room here, I would say to most of you, you live too long to die young. Okay, so there are so many. There's the physical will, right? The last one in the Testament, but there's also estate planning and cemetery plot and burial requests and living wills. Does anybody here not have a living will? In this country, we need to have a living will. And then there's also ethical wills. Do you know about ethical wills? In a way, this whole passage is an ethical will. An ethical will is where you sort of clear your throat and you say, kids, this is what I want to tell you. Make sure you give money to a Jewish National Fund and floss your teeth and be good to your sister. And these were the values that I lived by. More and more people today are writing ethical wills and doing video ethical wills. What I say to my students in my undergraduate death and dying class, I say, when you go home Thanksgiving, pull out your iPhone and sit with your grandparents and ask them questions. Many of you here have important stories to pass on to your family. Whether you want to do it in written form or whether you want to do it in video form, which is now an option that we didn't have up until relatively recently, and to have it so easily available. It's so important. It's part of both your own process of working towards closure and completion, and it's never too soon to do it. I'll do it when I get closer. It's never too soon to do it. And it's also part of the gift that you give. So what Jacob teaches us is that we want to get our, quote, estate in order, but that's not just our financial estate. It's psychological, it's spiritual, and it's also communal. The question that I want to ask your rabbi to put under his yarmulke is, what kind of community resources do you have here to support people at times of Shiva and burial planning and through the year of St. Kaddish? Because Judaism, we do death in community, and we do it well when we do it well. But it's both a personal concern, it's a familial concern, and it's also a communal concern. And what I have found is sometimes somebody who's like baby boomer, 50 years old, has an 85-year-old mother and says, I want to talk to my mother about her living will. And she says, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to deal with that. Or the other way around. The parents are elderly and they want to talk to their children. And she says, oh, come on, Ma, you're going to live forever. You're going to live, you're not going to die so soon. So if you have children like that, tell them that you live too long to die young. And let's have these conversations. Because I think that's what we can extract from this text, is to take home tonight much more of a willingness, and this whole weekend, much more of a willingness to have these conversations within your family and between you and your significant others. So that's the homework. I know on Shabbos we're not supposed to give homework, but it's a homework of conversation. And then the next one, Genesis 50:1-7 and 10. Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to, it says embalm, it's really more to mummify. Embalming is a whole other thing, but they definitely would have given him an Egyptian mummification process to mummify his father Israel. So the physicians mummified him, taking a full 40 days, for that was a time required for mummification. And the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, if I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. So Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and when they reached the threshing floor of Atad near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning. And in some cases, our rabbis grounded the practice of 7 days of Shiva in this particular text. But notice what he does. First he does a traditional Egyptian mourning ritual. That's another whole topic of conversation. Hang on to that one. And then they go do the 7 days of mourning up at Atad in Canaan. They don't say, let's sit Shiva for 3 days and get it over with. They don't say, come on, I don't really want to take the time to do that. What they do is they honor the psychological function of bereavement rituals. We have very good Jewish practices. Our Jewish practices have been eroded by American culture, by Southern culture, by Midwestern culture, and I have to be careful. I don't want to get thrown out of the country as a Canadian, but also by Puritan culture. The Puritans, usually I teach this stuff in the Northeast, so we're in the shadow of Protestant America. And the Puritans were thrown out of England. They were the Taliban of Protestant England. And they were very uptight. I know I may be destroying your mythos here, but they were very uptight. They didn't like Christmas. They didn't like Easter. They weren't wild about the witches, the women, and I'm sure they weren't that wild about the Jews. But they were not very comfortable around messy emotions. And dealing with death and grief is a messy emotion. And in Jewish community life, we had the ability to do that. And the American mythos around dealing with that has eroded our ability to deal with that and our traditions. So we want to go back and we want to claim that. Now, the other thing, in this passage, what's the lie that Joseph told? There's a lie here. Joseph says, he lies to Pharaoh. He says, he says, my father made me swear an oath and to bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Jacob did not dig his own tomb in the land of Canaan. Abraham bought it from the Hittites. But he had to say that to Pharaoh. If he would go to Pharaoh and say, listen, I want to go bury my father in Canaan, and Pharaoh would say, what are you talking about? We have the best burial mythology in the entire ancient Near East. If you've ever been to Egypt, you can see they really knew how to do it with their temples and the whole thing. So he says, my father dug his own tomb. And Pharaoh says, oh, your father dug his own tomb? That's serious. We definitely have to honor that. But nowhere in the text does it say that Jacob, in fact, buried his own tomb. And some of this marching at the threshing floor at Atad and lamented loudly is still picking up some of the old Egyptian rituals. They had a whole retinue that went north. They put it in the GPS and they went up to Atad and they did what shows up in Egyptian texts as mourning. But what we extract from that is that we have to do our mourning. To everything there is a season. A time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to be born, a time to die. And if we honor the ritual process, we do much better in life than if we don't. Because if we don't, it comes back much later as depression and alcoholism and family problems, etc. So, I want to begin to come in for a landing here and read the last text. So then when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his son, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So this is a very common image in Tanakh, that Abraham and Isaac were gathered to their people. Moses is shown a glimpse of the land of Canaan, and God says, now you will be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was. King Solomon slept with his ancestors. Death, in the language of the Bible, is to return to one's ancestral family. So what's going on? So there's a whole family tribe. And then when they died, they were nefesh met, a dead spirit, and they hung out with the ancestors in the family tomb. When he says, bury me in Machpelah, he's saying, I'm going to reconnect with my ancestors. There's not an overt sense of life after death in Judaism, in biblical tradition, but there's clearly a sense of some invisible realm where the deceased are hanging out. And it may be, when he says he was gathered to the ancestors, it may be like the near-death experiences talk about seeing the ancestors at the end of time. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow night when we do Afterlife Journey of the Soul in Kabbalah. So I want to come in for a landing with this notion that even in biblical times there's a sense of an interconnection through being gathered to the ancestors, being buried in the cave. And there's actually archaeological evidence that they would put food into the caves, the Canaanite, the Jewish, the Hebrew burial chambers to feed the ancestors. And so afterlife, I want to say, is part of biblical tradition. So who do you imagine being there for you? Who do you imagine being there to greet you when your time comes? I said to my mother at the end of her life, you might see your father after you go. And here she was over 80 years old, and she wouldn't have seen him in over 70 years or so, and she just lit up. So the Torah teaches us that yes, there's death, yes, there's transition, but life goes on. And perhaps what ultimately matters is how he lives our life. What we learn, how we live our lives, what we learn from Jacob is to live life with a sense of clarity, with a sense of faith, with a sense of trust. The book of Genesis ends, the story continues with the story of Exodus. And so ultimately, life goes on, and our ancestors teach us how to live a full life. And ultimately, it's not about your death, it's about life. So I invite you to take that home with you on this Shabbos, and I look forward to continuing the conversation over the next couple of days. Good Shabbos. Yeah, sure. Questions, gladly.
Somewhere around here we have a handheld mic, and Dr. Cantor usually does the job. There it is. Oh, here it is. So we have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question, maybe we'll give you the microphone and you can ask the question. Raise your hand. Very good. You want to?
Let somebody else be the runner.
I'll run.
I'll go.
So when I read the story of Jacob a few years ago, this part, the death scene, and I actually was very disillusioned. I had a view of a cranky old man who was complaining about all of his kids, how disappointed he was. He was bitter about the loss of his favorite wife, and he still mourned her. And there was no, and he just died. I mean, there was no uplifting quality in my mind, in my impression. I was very depressed, actually, after reading the whole thing.
You want to use the one up there? And we'll use this one, we'll circulate this one. How's that?
And he gave his son Joseph the directions to take care of his burial. And Joseph was like, I didn't even have a relationship with you all of these years. So the reality is, I try to extract a certain kind of broach to it, but in some ways, you're accurate. And some family deathbed scenes are filled with bitterness and are miserable and have a lot of resentment. And some people have a sense of also being able to be present for their loved ones and to be able to help somebody make the transition more gracefully. So we're living in a culture where we're trying to move from death as sort of the grim reaper to death as the being of light. And so this is true, and this is true.
Maybe if you have a question. For Dottie.
I'll go. I like to be Donahue. I'll go around.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm just curious about the request to put his hand under his thigh.
It's sort of like a notary. In that culture, it's like, if I'm going to trust you, I'm going to let you get real close. So that was actually a practice. That's where it came from. I'm not recommending anybody to do that, but just to understand it in its cultural context. Go and see a notary. That's what I recommend. Yeah.
You think differently about it, though, when you have lost a child, when you outlive a child. You don't go to, I personally don't go to the Bible, somebody who's 140 and who lived a long life. But you don't reconcile in the same way when you outlive a child. How do you respond to?
Look, there's no easy way to take away the pain and the loss when, God forbid it happens, that a parent has to bury a child. Because we often want to think that we would be memorialized and our children would remember us, but if that's been your experience, you are tasked with that. And we know that in families where they're more open about talking about the loss, where they do try, as we saw earlier tonight at Shabbat, where you try to honor and memorialize lost children. Such families do a lot better. I'm working with two mothers, both of whom lost children in the opioid epidemic. And one's, both of them are traumatized, but one's doing a lot better because she's taking care of herself and making connections with other people, and one is having a harder time because she's isolating and falling into a pattern of substance abuse. So there's no easy way to go through it, but some ways may be healthier than others, and I think we can still extract some of that wisdom. And I'm sorry that you have to go through that.
Other questions? I'm going to come around there while I'm making my way to the other side. Not the other side, but to the other side of the room. It's a hard conversation here. Could you comment a little bit on the notion of pre-demise mourning as it relates to extended Shiva?
Wait, can you say that again?
Can you speak about the notion of pre-demise mourning? For example, somebody is in hospice for an extended period of time, and then the person passes away, and then you have the issue of 7 days of Shiva. So is it the reality of today with pre-demise mourning that people have been standing vigil for often weeks, sometimes months, does that change the nature of the need for 7 days of Shiva?
Well, when you're doing anticipatory mourning, you're really letting go of your attachment to somebody's life. And listen, somebody has a mother, when it happens, has been in an Alzheimer unit for a decade. My Auntie Rose said, I don't want a funeral, I want a funeral. A funeral. And so I want to be very cautious in encouraging people to not do 7 days of Shiva, but do 7 days of celebrating somebody's life. If you've done your mourning, if you feel you've done your mourning, then figure out what would be a way to bring integrity to honoring a person's life. And it doesn't have to be a solemn 7 days. It could be a different kind of 7 days.
I have a comment I have a Jewish question, which is a comment with a question mark at the end.
Is there a rabbi in the house?
Shh, you're blowing my cover. I'm fascinated by this whole business of being gathered to the ancestors. There's a book called The Last Man of His Tribe, which is written about a California Aboriginal man who interestingly enough in his language was called Ishi, right? And Ishi is the last man because his entire tribe was wiped out by white people who wanted their wealth. In other words, it was a form of early 20th century genocide of Aboriginal peoples. And I'm always struck, both in the book and in the film, about this thing of being gathered to the ancestors. And my question is being gathered to the ancestors a happy thing or a sad thing?
Well, if you knew my family. No.
Shh. Don't talk about my family.
It sort of takes us a little bit into the conversation about afterlife. This is like next week on Oprah, so this is like tomorrow night. We'll talk about that. But there are some passages where they talk about how the angels come and remove our terrestrial garments and put on our celestial garments. So in some families, when we're wearing our terrestrial garments, it's kind of schleppy. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of woundedness in families. I worked with somebody who had so much so much trauma in her relationship with her father that she would talk. If she wanted to go to the cemetery and dig him up and kill him. So I try to imagine what it might be when they reunited. But maybe the union with the ancestors is not only the personality union, but also soul to soul union, where we have certain kind of soul contracts and that. So, and there are Swedenborg, who was a Swedish mystic, talked about how soul families stick together. My wife went to see a psychic, and she saw my father, and they were all partying, which is what my father's family was. He had a big family, and they were singers, and they were kibitzers, and they would hang out together. So, I don't know.
So you talked about...
Hold on. Ultimately, all of this stuff is, like I read a lot of text, but ultimately, I have to confess, even that ultimately, as a scholar, I try to get some of these texts. As a psychologist, I try to get some of the meaning of it. But as a mortal human beings, I have to say there are no final answers to the mystery of life and death. And I think all of those are true. Please.
You talked about talking about death more or bringing it out of the shadows. But when you're with somebody who's imminently going to die, there's so much stress and pain and suffering. It's very hard to talk to them about. I mean, as a psychologist and a rabbi, what do you suggest when you're at the moment? Because they're afraid, you're afraid. It's
Well,
really,
one thing
talk
is,
about it.
what else? Is there something else you need to say to me? Is there anything else we need to say to each other? I think that the bottom line when somebody is right on their deathbed is to be able to say, look, you've done the best that you could. We've tried to love each other as well as we could, even with our sometimes our limitations. We're going to be okay when you go, and you're not going to be alone. We're going to be here, and you're going to be greeted by loved ones on the other side. And whenever you're ready to go, it's okay to go. So I think that's that moment, that's the important stuff that we've tried to be able to do with people. But I think these are not wait until the last minute conversations. I think I'm starting to work with somebody who has a terminal illness that she doesn't know how long it's going to last. It could be. She's going to do a cell stem transplant, and it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years. But I said, you need to go home and talk to your husband about changing dynamics, that you're needing him to be more of a caretaker for you. So if we have these conversations in advance and we're not afraid of them, then it's just a continuation of them. One of the Hasidic Rebbes said his wife started crying as he was dying, and she said, why are you crying? My whole life was a preparation that I might die. I don't agree that he didn't let her cry, but his whole life was a preparation that he might die. And maybe that's true.
I wanted to go back to the Shiva question. I believe in the 7-day Shiva or having a long Shiva, but you mentioned, I think people do shorten Shivas because they maybe want to move on with life in our culture, and that's been influenced from others. But I think there's some who don't do a longer Shiva or do a 3-day Shiva because Shiva is about community, and our communities are more spread out now. And there may not be community to come for 7 days. And to me, it's about people visiting and spending time with you in that Shiva period. So I think sometimes when we decide, or individuals decide to do a shorter Shiva, it's because they feel like there won't be people around for 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, so let's do 3. Certainly if there's someone younger who dies, it's more thought of as more tragic, there's more people who come. When it's an older individual, there's not as many people around to visit. So I just wanted your thoughts on that. Is it worth doing, is it something you do a Shiva if there's nobody there to visit with you?
Well, I talk to people about Kaddish. Right? A lot of people, I don't go to synagogue regularly. I'm not going to go say Kaddish 3 times a day for sure. I may go once once a week, but more likely I'll go once a month, and maybe not even that. And I say, there's a Kaddish as a ritual process, but there's also Kaddish as a kind of psychological moment. So take a Kaddish moment every day to be with your father, with your mother. So somebody says, I'm going to do my exercises every morning, and I'm going to take a Kaddish moment. Somebody says, actually, I would say Kaddish for my father when I was in the shower in the morning. And when I tried to do it with my mother, I was like, I couldn't say Kaddish for my mother when I was in the shower. It was very interesting. Somebody I knew did a cremation, and they scattered their parents' remains in the river, and they went across a bridge every day so that was like the moment. So to apply that to Shiva, if you can't do a communal celebration, don't rush back to work. Give yourself the week time, because the heart needs the time for adaptation. So maybe there's other Shiva-like activities. Maybe what I'm going to do for Shiva is go to a park that I would go to with my father when I was a younger person. Or maybe I'm going to take one day and I'm going to go up to our favorite place in the country. So I think I'm speaking of it from a psychological point of view, not only from a ritual point of view, that the heart needs some time for adapting to the transition that's going. And next week on Oprah, I'll talk about this tomorrow night, for 7 days the soul goes back and forth from its grave to its former home, mourning for the body. So there's a 7-day period where the soul sticks around. So we want to make time to be open to that.
What a great cliffhanger that is for tomorrow. Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rabbi Simcha Raphael, we give him a big round of applause. Tomorrow, we'll daven at 9 o'clock in the morning. Reb Simcha is going to teach the Torah for Today class at 10:15. It'll take place in the banquet hall, not on the other side of the building, because we're really under construction over there. Please be careful, so come on this side of the building. And then he'll give a little sermonette in shul as well. On Saturday.
Sermonette is his way of telling me make it real short.
Yes, real short, like a raisinette, a sermonette. And then on Saturday night, we'll join together. If you haven't registered, please do feel free to come. We'll have a Western Spur. All the Western congregations, most of the Western Spur congregations are joining together for a Tikkun Leil Shavuot over a traditional congregation. On Sunday, Reb Simcha will give the Dvar Torah, and on Monday he'll speak before Yizkor. He has some beautiful things prepared. So I think there's a wonderful beginning. Shabbat Shalom, Yisher Koach. See everybody tomorrow with God's help, and if not tomorrow, the tomorrow after tomorrow.